Today, it's half a Monday evening property rant. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one that is post covering finance and property news. I'm sorry to say that Edwin is still so much under the weather that he can't make the show tonight, hopefully later in the week. But this gives me the opportunity of sharing some of my thoughts ahead of the productivity conversations which are going on this week. This is, of course, a big deal, and I think a lot of the discussion so far is perhaps missing the point. Actually, I made a show called Have the Productivity Nuts and Bolts Bolted? And my argument there was that actually a lot of the focus is on the wrong things, and that effectively the critical issues that should be being discussed aren't going to be discussed. But it is worth just checking over what is going on over the next 2 or 3 days. So here is the economic roundtable agenda from August the 19th to the 21st. The first day is about resilience, and we're going to have Albanese, Chalmers, and Bullock all talking. And then we're going to look at things like international risk, skills attraction, capital attraction, and Chalmers is going to wrap up day one. Day two is about productivity, although, of course, there is a big question about defining productivity in the first place. Danielle Wood from the Productivity Commission is going to lead off, of course, on that. And then we're going to look at regulation, competition, AI and innovation. Chalmers is going to wrap up again. And day three is going to be about budget sustainability and tax reform, which is talking about, for example, the budget sustainability, efficiency in delivery of government services, better tax system, and Chalmers is going to wrap up that too. So a bit of a talk fest, and I'm a bit skeptical, I'm afraid, as to whether we're going to get anything particularly useful out of the back. But nevertheless, it is quite interesting just understanding some of the dynamics here. So a good starting point, I think, is to look at the RBA. And this article just highlights the fact that perhaps RBA is too optimistic on the inflation side, and that is casting doubts about rate cuts. Paul Bloxham at HSBC actually made the point that the RBA will deliver 2 more rate cuts, but not because of the local economy. He argues that Australia's persistently weak productivity, which could support higher inflation, doesn't justify further cuts on their own. And of course, everybody's picked up on this issue of the 0.7% productivity improvement, which the RBA put in their last forecast, which, as I discussed in my earlier show, was a plug number rather than actually any scientific analysis. But John Kehoe wrote in the AFR, lower pay rises, weaker consumer spending, softer business profits, and a handbrake on living standards. That's the bleak outlook for Australia as the nation's productivity slumps ahead of Treasurer Jim Chalmers' economic roundtable. Even resorting to the 20-year average productivity growth could be too optimistic, given productivity has been stagnant since 2016. And he concluded that Chalmers and his fellow travellers must confront what is the government's policy control and use the RBA's productivity bombshell as the burning platform for reform to lift living standards. Australians deserve a brighter future than the grim new reality. And that really is the point. We know at the moment that many households are continuing to struggle. In terms of real income growth, there's not a lot to see. Costs of living are still rising. And the future trajectory doesn't look great. This is from Chris Richardson, highlighting the fact that the average annual growth in living standards over the past decade, well, Australia's at the bottom of the list there. But he did say, well, I've updated the chart on living standards over the past decade. The good news is that the Australian average has improved since my last update. Oh, yeah, improved, but not very much. We are really languishing in Australia. So, ahead of the upcoming roundtable, there was a leaked report via the ABC from Treasury. And in short, the Treasury advice prepared ahead of the Albanese government productivity talks revealed a number of possible announcements, including a freeze on the National Construction Code and also looking to cut red tape and speeding up housing approvals by reforming environmental laws. That sounds like a very low ball there. And it's interesting that in this article, they also wrote that the industry has approached next week's summit cautiously after some business leaders left the government's 2022 Jobs and Skills Summit, feeling the government had entered with a predetermined outcome. So yes, it is possible there is a predetermination here. And the other interesting observation, ASIC announced that it would conduct a review last week, which aims to boost superannuation funds' ability to invest in housing projects by changing the way they disclose stamp duty payments. So once and again, it does seem to me that the whole focus here is being pushed towards housing, and more housing, which of course is a significant issue, but it's not by far the critical issue that I think we should be thinking about now in terms of productivity. And by the way, it is worth just trying to understand what we mean by productivity. It's basically about inputs and outputs, how much effort and energy we need to put into things to get a bigger outcome. At the moment, what we're doing is we're putting a lot of inputs in, including, of course, higher taxes and other factors, government spending, for example, but we're not getting much out of the machine. And so on a per capita basis, productivity is going backwards, which means that in real terms, households are going backwards. And the longer that goes on, the worse it gets. Now, it was quite interesting that Allegra Spender actually put a little thought piece into the Fin Review. She's the member for Wentworth. And she highlighted 4 areas, which I thought was quite interesting. The first one is about regulation. The energy that is building around regulatory reform across the political spectrum is an enormous opportunity. We need to get consensus on key areas such as federal government laws and housing regulation. However, to maximize the opportunity, we must address the underlying incentives and institutions that drive the regulatory hairball. She's quoting there the Productivity Commission. Absolutely, it isn't just housing, it's across the whole sector. As a small business, I know how much regulatory weight is carried by small businesses, for example, but nobody really wants to talk about that. The second thing she highlighted was that tax. We shouldn't pretend we can design a new tax system in an afternoon. Tax is incredibly politically sensitive, but the urgency to address productivity and intergenerational inequality cannot be ignored. The most important thing the talks could achieve this week is charting a path forward on tax reform that keeps as many options on the table and people in the tent as possible. Yes, tax reform is a big deal, but I suspect they're going to be thinking about assets of ordinary people and how to tax them rather than perhaps the high end of town. We'll come on to that shortly. The third, she wrote, we must confront challenges in government spending and services, especially the rapidly growing care economy. Consensus on tactical improvements in areas like aligning accreditation and registration of carers should be possible, but we need agreement on more profound directional changes. These start with acknowledging the NDS cannot grow at 8% a year and move to more creative questions of how to shift towards more prevention in health, how AI can improve service delivery and avoid further growth in the public sector. I absolutely agree that the NDIS is unsustainable, and as we discussed recently, a large proportion of kids are now getting sucked into the NDIS. Not sure that's good or sensible. And finally, climate policy must be recalibrated to minimize cost. Australia's current approach, various subsidies, incentives, and sector-specific schemes are moving the economy where it needs to go, but the lack of a carbon price makes the energy transition slower and more expensive than it could be. Well, energy is, I agree, the issue, but of course, whether that approach of net zero makes sense is a big debate and certainly open to some question. Now, developers, of course, want productivity improvement and tax improvement, and so this article highlights Stockland and Mervac pushing back against the federal Labor government's decision to rule out tax changes at this week's Economic Reform Roundtable. Yeah, interestingly, there is a debate about tax, but it's a rather hobbled debate about tax. And then Ross Gittings actually contributed this really interesting article, which is basically starting from the point that our economy is becoming unbalanced and it's in danger of slowing to a halt. But the question, of course, is how we can actually improve efficiency and how do we manage to raise our living standards. And the truth is that there's been no improvement in productivity for a decade. So who's responsible for fixing the problem? And it is for the government to do, as the Reserve Bank said, but he then did cite the 0.7% baseline from Michelle Bullock. And he went on to say that there's another reason why productivity is pretty weak. It's the growth of the non-market sector, particularly aged care. When the taxpayer is covering the cost, it's hard to measure productivity. And when the care objective is as much about quantity as well as quality, it's hard to replace a motherly nurse with a robot. And then he goes on to talk about the pro-business bias coming from the neoclassical model of the economy that every economist carries in their head, which assumes that businesses respond rationally to the incentives they face. No, they don't. They're just as susceptible to fads and fashions as the rest of us, fashions reinforced by the share market and its analysts. QAI, I thought at that point. And he goes on to make the point the trouble is the economy is circular. When businesses fatten their profits at the expense of its workers, those workers turn into households that don't have as much to spend on things that businesses are selling. So there is an inherent link between productivity, profit growth, and also wages. It goes on to say, back on productivity, one big reason businesses haven't been investing much in the labor-saving technology that increases their productivity is that they're not paying a lot for their labor. So he suggests using generous pay rises to raise the cost of labor relative to capital and then watch our productivity improve, retrospectively justifying the generous pay rises. So perhaps the Reserve Bank needs to switch to a growth mindset, but of course, higher wages growth leads to higher inflation, which leads to higher interest rates. So there is something there that cannot be squared. Now, I have had the view for some time that there are a few areas where we should be focusing. Of course, the gas sector and the fact that it is broken is, as the Australian Institute shows here, we're one of the biggest gas exporters in the world, and we get next to nothing for offshore LNG. That should be on the table. I absolutely agree. We are one of the biggest gas exporters in the world, but we're paying top dollar for our gas, international prices, and that leads to the high energy costs, which is hurting industry as well as households. Yep, that should be discussed, should be one of the critical things, reserve gas. And even BlueScope here warns that the soaring energy costs threaten Australian manufacturing as profits drop 90%. Speaking after the company's AGM, BlueScope CEO Mark Valassa said energy costs in Australia are now 3 to 4 times higher than in the US, and that risks undermining the country's future made in Australia vision. In what world does exporting LNG in massive quantities only to re-import it to supply a shorted domestic market makes any sense? He said, absolutely. It's not about the import of offshore gas. It's about stopping the gas going out of the country at prices which are wrong relative to what we should be paying locally, and then not taxing those large international players, and then forcing us to buy back at international prices. This is why Australia is grinding to a halt. Oh, and by the way, talking about grinding to a halt, of course, there are now rising fears of a net zero blowout with the New South Wales government rushing legislation through Parliament last week to speed up the delivery of vital stabilising infrastructure required to replace the looming closure of the Arang power station. It's unconscionable that New South Wales is even contemplating blackouts in 2 years, the article said. Well, I agree about that. Now let's talk about the other big one, of course, migration. This little article here shows that we are now bringing in 1 migrant per minute coming to Australia 24/7. That's according to Ben Fordham. And the latest numbers reveal a migration explosion. And interestingly, if you look at the IFM analysis here, you can see here that a lot of the migration is other migration. So it's not permanently skilled, it's not temporarily skilled, it's everything else. That is unsustainable. And on that point, I made a show yesterday. I made a show about the Kiwi story, where they've dialed back migration and housing affordability is easing, whereas in Australia, migration is very high, housing affordability is bust. There's a very strong correlation. And I upset quite a few people, by the way, when I made this direct connection between housing prices and migration. But the truth is, there is evidence to suggest that that is actually the truth. So we should be thinking about migration much harder and dialing it back to the point where it matches the ability to build houses for people coming in the country. High migration equals high home prices. So why isn't that on the table? I guess it won't be touched on through the productivity discussions. Now, here's another one. How rich people pay no taxes. The truth is the tax system is rorted by those able to pay to do it. And they make the point in this little chart here that normal people may get a salary, even if it's a big salary, even if a CEO gets paid, but they then pay a significant amount on income tax and they keep the rest. But one way of paying less tax is to be paid in company stock. And then when the CEO sells the stock, they pay 25% capital gains tax and keep $750,000. But the real trick here is that you don't have to pay tax at all. You get $1 million of company stock, but that CEO then uses his stocks as collateral to borrow money from the bank. He spends the borrowed money like it's his income, but legally debt is not treated as real income, so on paper he has no income, and his stocks meanwhile continue to appreciate, and he only pays capital gains tax if and when he sells his assets. So this seems to me to be a very important discussion about the relativity between capital gains tax and the other types of income tax, and the way that the top end are able to, frankly, mug the system to their benefit, meaning that everybody else is having to pay more and more income tax. But whether that will be discussed or ever changed is a big open question for me. It is a very significant one to think about. Now, just briefly on the RBA decision, I just want to highlight how this has now stoked the chat about the property market. Obviously, they cut to 3.6%. And of course, Lucy there was writing again, auction clearance leaps to 75% as RBA cuts boost confidence. Interest rate cut has created more confidence in the market as preliminary clearance rates increased to their highest level since April last year, and agents saw renewed activity after months of stagnation. Yeah, well, look at the domain preliminary, and you can see there that they're quoting 76% in Sydney and 72% in Melbourne, which is higher than last week. But look again at the number sold compared to the number reported, compared to the number listed. Again, this is misleading information. It does not tell us anything useful. And just continuing the property trend, property developer Mervac says conditions are ripe for housing to take off as interest rates fall further, and it's going to kick off new projects. HSBC talks about the rate cuts will put up house prices. HSBC's chief economist Bob Bloxham is expecting solid house price growth to continue after interest rate cut, with his bank forecasting rates of between 4 and 9% in 2026. The rate cut would spur activity for all property purchases, including for first home buyers, but the rise in house prices will also exacerbate the existing housing affordability challenges, he said. Oh, and by the way, latest data also show that investors jumped back into the housing market faster than first home buyers and owner-occupiers in the June quarter, as they took advantage of the lower borrowing costs after just 2 rate cuts and faced fewer affordability hurdles. Investor borrowers secured an extra 1,656 loan agreements in the 3 months to June. That's a 3.5% jump in the March quarter. And just to round that out, it's worth highlighting that September rate cuts may look a little less likely because of the employment statistics. The jobless rate fell to 4.2%, and about 24,500 people found work in July. And I discussed this in my recent show, Population Booms, again as unemployment falls. But here is another take, and this is to do with the lack of competition. A recent report came out suggesting that the Australian economy will be about $80 billion or $3,000 per person larger if key sectors had not been dominated by a few companies capable of driving up profits because of reduced competition. And of course, across the industries, you could think about the airline industry, you could think about the banks, you could think about the supermarkets, and pretty much every sector in Australia has a few dominant players, which allows them to charge excess profits at the expense of consumers. So competition, again, should be on the discussion through this week. Just to bring this to a close, my point is this, that the upcoming talkfest is unlikely, to my mind, to touch the real critical issues that we should be talking about. There will be a lot of performative action. There'll be a lot of hot air. But at the end of the day, I'm not convinced that we're going to see a lot of light out of the end of the discussion. There are some wonderful things that could be done that would fundamentally move the dial and move Australia back to a much better place for its occupants. And the problem, of course, is that businesses are pulling in one direction, but that direction is not necessarily in the interests of households. And politicians have a vested interest in supporting and being supported by big business, not least because of the revolving door between big business and politics, of course. And so very often what we find is that the politicians actually hook policies because they don't want to hurt big business. I'll highlight there the financial sector and big gas, as well as the supermarkets and airlines. So the question ahead is, are we going to continue to be a prisoner of weak productivity, high migration, and high inflation? At the moment, it looks as though we probably are. But I'm not holding my breath for any outcomes through this week. Now, if you're buying your home in Sydney's contentious market, you don't need to stand alone. This is the time you need to have Edwin Almeida from Ribbon Property Consultants standing alongside you. Buying a property is both challenging and adversarial. The vendor has a professional on their side. Emotions run high, price discovery and price transparency are hard to find, and then there's the wasted time and financial investments that you make. Edwin understands your needs, so why not engage a licensed professional to stand alongside you? With RPC, you know you have experience, knowledge, and master negotiators looking after your best interests. So shoot Ribbon an email at info@ribbonproperty.com.au, and if you use the promo code DFAWTW/Martin, you can get a 10% discount offer. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.